The year was 1462, on the rocky shores of Lesbos. Ottoman cannons thundered against Genoese fortifications as Sultan Mehmed II's forces prepared to claim another prize in their relentless expansion across the Mediterranean. Among the Sipahi cavalry charging through the smoke and chaos was a soldier named Yaka Paka, whose participation in this conquest would reshape the fate of the Middle Sea for generations to come. Yakupa Aka was among those appointed by Sultan Mehmed II to capture Lesbos from the Genoese in 1462. And he was granted the fief of Banova village as a reward for fighting for the cause. This Turkish or Albanian warrior from Yenis had earned his place in the Ottoman war machine through skill and loyalty. But his true legacy would be forged not in the moment of victory, but in the years that followed, in the aftermath of conquest. He married a local Greek girl from Mytilene named Katerina, and they had 2 daughters and 4 sons, Ishak, Oruk, Hizir, and Ilyas. The union between the Ottoman soldier and the Greek Christian woman represented the complex reality of Mediterranean life in the 16th century, a world where empires clashed but individuals found ways to build lives across the fault lines of faith and culture. Yakup became an established potter and purchased a boat to trade his products. The transition from warrior to craftsman was not uncommon in the Ottoman system, where military service could lead to civilian prosperity. His pottery workshop in Banova village became the foundation of a modest but stable family business. With the Aegean serving as both highway and marketplace for his wares, the 4 brothers grew up in this world of clay and salt water. At first, Oruk helped with the boat, while Hizir helped with pottery. The eldest, Ishak, the bold Oruk, the observant Hizir, and the youngest, Liazich, would be shaped by the rhythms of their father's trade and the endless horizons visible from their island home. But the Mediterranean of the early 16th century was no place for peaceful merchants. The Ottoman Empire was expanding rapidly under Bayezid II and his successor Selim I, creating opportunities for ambitious young men, but also exposing them to the violent realities of a world in constant flux. Christian corsairs from Malta and Rhodes preyed on Muslim shipping, while Ottoman raiders struck back at Venetian and Genoese vessels. Every trading voyage carried the risk of capture, enslavement, or death. It was during one such expedition that tragedy struck the family. During a trading expedition in Tripoli, Lebanon, he and Ilyas were attacked by a galley of the Knights Hospitaller. Ilyas was killed in the fight and Arouge was wounded. Their father's boat was captured, and Arouge was taken prisoner and detained. In the Knights' Bodrum castle for nearly 3 years, the loss of Ilyas and the capture of Oruk shattered the family's peaceful existence. For young Hizir, watching his father's dreams sink beneath the waves while his brothers paid the price in blood and chains, the lesson was clear. In this world, the strong preyed upon the weak, and only those willing to embrace violence could hope to survive. The pottery wheels still turned in Banova village, but the boy who had once shaped clay with gentle hands now dreamed of reshaping the world itself. The Mediterranean had taken his brother's life and his family's livelihood. Soon, it would learn to fear the name that Hizir would make for himself upon its waves. The transformation had begun not through a single moment of trauma, but through the grinding reality of life in an empire built on conquest, where even potters' sons learned that survival meant mastering the art of war. By the time Kir was an adult, around 1500, both he and his brother had left their Greek homeland as privateers, roaming the eastern Mediterranean Sea in search of prey, either Christian or Muslim. The transformation from pottery makers' sons to corsairs was not uncommon in the volatile Mediterranean of the early 16th century, where the line between legitimate trade and piracy often blurred beyond recognition. Khizr began his naval career as a corsair under his elder brother, Oruk Reis. Oruk had emerged from his years of captivity at Bodrum Castle, a changed man, harder, more calculating, and driven by a burning desire for revenge against the Christian powers that had enslaved him. The younger brother became his eager student, absorbing lessons in seamanship, navigation, and the brutal arithmetic of naval warfare. Their first major success came in 1502 or 1503, when Uruk captured the island of Jerba for the Hafsids, the ruling dynasty of Tunisia. This was no mere raid, but a calculated political move that established the brothers as players in the complex web of North African politics. Jerba, strategically positioned between the eastern and western Mediterranean, became their first real base of operations. The brothers understood that successful corsairing required more than just seamanship, demanded intelligence networks, political alliances, and the ability to inspire loyalty among crews drawn from across the Mediterranean world. Their ships became floating melting pots where Muslim refugees from Spain, Greek Orthodox Christians, Janissary deserters, and Italian renegades worked side by side. United by the promise of plunder and the brotherhood of the sea, he often attacked Spanish coasts and their territories on the coast of North Africa. But these were not random acts of piracy. Each raid was carefully planned, targeting Spanish supply lines and coastal fortresses that supported the Christian reconquisters' expansion into North Africa. The brothers had witnessed firsthand how Spanish power was strangling Muslim communities across the Mediterranean, and their corsairing became a form of warfare by other means. The evolution of their tactics reflected Uruk's growing sophistication. As a naval commander, Barbary corsairs employed two basic sorts of ships: oared galleys, which hunted the Mediterranean, or square-rigged ships, which plied the Atlantic littoral. Both types were armed with cannons of various calibers. Galleys mounted their cannons in the prow, allowing for devastating bow-on attacks that could cripple enemy vessels before they could bring their own guns to bear. For Khizr, these early years were a masterclass in the art of command. He watched his brother manage the delicate balance of discipline and democracy that kept corsair crews functional. He learned how to read the wind and tide, how to judge the speed and armament of distant sails, and how to make the split-second decisions that meant the difference between victory and win. Death. The psychological transformation was as important as the tactical education. A grieving boy who had watched his family's boat disappear into the night's custody was becoming a hardened warrior who understood that mercy was a luxury the Mediterranean rarely afforded. Yet this hardening was tempered by a keen intelligence and an ability to inspire loyalty that would serve him well in the years to come. He became known as Baba Arouge, Father Arouge, when he transported large numbers of Morisco, Muslim, and Jewish refugees from Spain to North Africa, detail that reveals how the brothers' activities extended far beyond simple piracy. They were active participants in one of history's great population movements, ferrying thousands of displaced peoples to new lives across the sea by 1510. The names of the Barbarossa brothers were whispered in fear across Christian Europe and spoken with hope in Muslim North Africa. They had built their reputation one captured ship at a time, but their ambitions were growing beyond the confines of mere corsairing. The Mediterranean was becoming their stage, and they were preparing to play for much higher stakes than gold and prisoners. The apprenticeship was nearly complete. Soon, Khizr would face his first real test of leadership as the brothers prepared to make their boldest move yet. By 1516, Uruk Barbarossa had evolved far beyond the role of a simple corsair. His ambitions now reached towards something unprecedented in the Mediterranean, the creation of an independent Muslim state that could stand against the expanding power of Christian Spain. The opportunity came through an invitation that would change the course of North African history. The ruler of Algiers, Slim al-Timek, faced mounting pressure from Spanish forces entrenched in their fortress at Pennon, just offshore from the city. Desperate for military assistance, he invited the Barbarossa brothers to help defend his realm. It was a decision that would prove fatally naive. In 1516, the three brothers succeeded in liberating Jejel and Algiers from the Spaniards, but eventually assumed control over the cities and surrounding region, forcing the previous ruler, Abu Hamu Musa, III of the Zayyanid dynasty, to flee. The conquest was swift and decisive. Not a man to miss an opportunity, Uruk established his rule in the city of Algiers, disposing of the emir, who was apparently drowned while having his daily bath. Uruk then had himself proclaimed Sultan, to the joy of his brother and a growing army of supporters. The drowning of Sklim al-Timt, whether accidental or deliberate, marked the end of the last independent Muslim ruler of Algiers and the beginning of the Barbarossa era. In 1516, the brothers captured Algiers from Spain, with Uruk declaring himself Sultan. This was no mere territorial grab, it was a political revolution that transformed the brothers from seafaring raiders into sovereigns of a nascent state. Their conquest forced the reigning ruler, Abu Hamid Musa III of the Bani Ziyad dynasty, to flee, effectively ending his control over the region. As the Spaniards retreated to the fortress of Penn, they sought aid from Charles V, King of Spain and Holy Roman Emperor. The establishment of the Sultanate of Algiers represented Uruk's vision of a unified North African empire that could serve as a bulwark against Christian expansion. The Barbarossa brothers turned the city of Algiers into an Islamic bastion against Catholic Spain in the Western Mediterranean, making it the capital of what would become the early modern Algerian state. The strategic implications were enormous for the first time since the fall of Granada. Muslim forces had established a major base of operations within striking distance of Spanish territory. However, Uruk's declaration of independence created a delicate diplomatic challenge. The Ottoman Empire under Sultan Selim I was the rising power in the Islamic world. No Muslim ruler could afford to ignore Ottoman interests. The capture of Algiers in 1516 had been made possible with the support of Ottoman Sultan Selim I, creating an immediate debt of gratitude that would soon require repayment. The brothers faced the classic dilemma of regional strongmen: how to maintain practical independence while acknowledging the theoretical supremacy of a distant empire. He did this in 1517 and offered Algiers to the Ottoman Sultan Selim I. The Sultan accepted Algiers as an Ottoman Sanjak province, appointed Uruk governor of Algiers and chief sea governor of the West Mediterranean, and promised to support him with janissaries, galleys, and cannon. This formal submission to Ottoman authority was a masterful political calculation. By acknowledging Selim I as his overlord, Uruk gained access to the military resources of the empire while retaining de facto control over his territories. The title of governor was largely ceremonial in practice. He ruled Algiers as an independent sovereign, accountable to no one but himself. For Khizr, watching his brother navigate these treacherous political waters was an education in statecraft. He observed how Uruk balanced the competing demands of his diverse subjects or merchants: Berber tribesmen, Ottoman janissaries, and European renegades, while maintaining the loyalty of his corsair captains. The art of ruling former enemies required skills far removed from the straightforward brutality of naval warfare. The Spanish response was swift and predictable. Charles V, the Holy Roman Emperor, could not allow a Muslim state to flourish so close to Spanish shores. The threat posed by the Barbarossa brothers extended far beyond their individual territories. They represented the possibility of a unified Muslim resistance that could roll back centuries of Christian gains in the Mediterranean. As Spanish forces massed for a counterattack, Uruk began to prepare for the siege that would define his legacy. He understood that the real test of his new state would come not in its creation, but in its survival. The pottery maker's son, who had declared himself Sultan, was about to discover whether his ambitions had exceeded his capabilities. The stage was set for a confrontation that would determine not just the fate of Algiers, but the future balance of power in the Western Mediterranean. In the growing shadow of Spanish preparation, Khizr found himself transitioning from loyal lieutenant to indispensable advisor as his brother's grand vision approached its moment of ultimate trial. Death of a brother, birth of Barbarossa, the morning of September 1518 dawned gray and ominous over the white walls of Algiers, as if the very heavens sensed the tragedy that would unfold before the sun reached its zenith. Spanish banners fluttered from the masts of Diego de Vera's formidable fleet, their crimson crosses stark against the Mediterranean's troubled waters. For months, the brothers had anticipated this moment, the inevitable reckoning that would determine whether their North African stronghold would survive or crumble beneath the weight of Christian reconquest. Uruk Reis stood upon the ramparts of the Kasbah, his legendary red beard, catching the salt-laden breeze as he surveyed the approaching armada. At 44, the elder Barbarossa had become a living legend, his name whispered in equal measures of fear and admiration from Constantinople to Cadiz. Beside him, Khizr watched his brother's weathered face, seeing not the fearsome corsair of 1,000 tales, but the potter's son from Lesbos, who had dared to challenge empires. "The Spaniards come in force this time," Uruk murmured, his voice carrying the weight of premonition. 20 ships, perhaps more? They mean to end what we've built here?" Kaiser's hand instinctively moved to his own beard, still dark where his brothers had turned the color of autumn flame. "Then we make them pay dearly for every stone, every grain of sand." The siege that followed tested every lesson the brothers had learned in their decades of warfare. Spanish artillery thundered against Algiers' fortifications while arquebusiers advanced under cover of pavesses, their methodical approach a stark contrast to the wild charges of earlier Christian expeditions. This was no mere raid or punitive expedition, it was a calculated campaign of annihilation, orchestrated by men who understood that the Barbarossa brothers represented more than mere pirates. They were the embodiment of Ottoman expansion, the spearhead of a new order that threatened to remake the Mediterranean's ancient balance. For 3 days, the defenders held their ground with desperate courage. Uruk seemed to be everywhere. At once, his voice rising above the din of battle as he rallied his men, his scimitar flashing in the smoke-filled air. Yet even legends have their limits, and the Spanish noose tightened with each passing hour. On the 4th day, as the enemy breached the outer walls, Uruk made his final stand at the harbor's edge. Surrounded by Spanish steel, the great corsair fought with the fury of a man who had lived without compromise and would die the same way. When the last sword stroke fell, it was not merely a man who perished, but an era the age of the elder Barbarossa had ended in blood and glory. Khizr witnessed his brother's death from across the harbor, powerless to intervene as enemy forces cut off any avenue of rescue. In that moment of devastating loss, something fundamental shifted within him. The younger brother, the careful strategist who had often counseled patience over passion, felt the old world die with Uruk. What emerged from that crucible of grief was something harder, more calculating, a man who would honor his brother's memory not through reckless heroism, but through methodical conquest. The psychological transformation was immediate and profound. That very night, as he evacuated the remnants of their forces to the safety of Jejel, Khizr made decisions that would reshape the Mediterranean world. First, he formally adopted the name Hayreddin, protector of the faith, signaling his evolution from mere corsair to champion of Islamic expansion. The red beard he had inherited was no longer simply a family trait. It became a banner, a symbol of continuity that would bridge the gap between the old Barbarossa and the new. More crucially, Hayreddin made the strategic decision that would define his reign, complete alignment with the Ottoman Empire, where Uruk had maintained a careful independence, accepting Ottoman support while preserving his autonomy. Hayreddin saw the future with crystalline clarity. The age of individual corsair kingdoms was ending. Only by binding his fate to the sultans could he hope to achieve the grand vision that had driven both brothers, the transformation of the Mediterranean into an Islamic lake. The loss of his brother had forged Hayreddin into something his enemies would find far more dangerous than the legendary Uruk, where the elder Barbarossa had been a force of nature. Unpredictable and devastating, Hayreddin became a grand strategist, capable of thinking not in terms of individual battles, but entire campaigns, not in seasons, but in decades. The grief that might have broken a lesser man instead crystallized. His purpose with diamond hardness, his first major decisions as the new Barbarossa revealed this transformation. Rather than attempting to immediately reclaim Algiers through force, he began the patient work of building a new kind of power, one based not on personal charisma alone, but on institutional strength. He cultivated relationships with Ottoman officials, standardized his fleet's operations, and began recruiting not just corsairs, but administrators, engineers, and scholars who could help him create a lasting legacy. The Mediterranean had become his stage for both revenge and conquest, but now he would write the script with the precision of a master dramatist. Each raid would serve a larger purpose. Each alliance would advance a grander design. The Spanish had killed a rook race, but in doing so, they had awakened something far more formidable, a strategic genius who would spend the next 3 decades systematically dismantling their Mediterranean empire, piece by calculated piece. In the flickering lamplight of his new headquarters at Jajel, Hayreddin Barbarossa studied the charts that would guide his revenge. The red beard that had once been merely inheritance now burned with the fires of destiny itself. From pirate to admiral in the grand halls of Topkapi Palace, where the whispers of courtiers mingled with the rustle of silk and the subtle scratch of quills recording the empire's business, an audacious proposal was about to reshape the balance of Mediterranean power. The year was 1519, and Hayreddin Barbarossa, barely a year removed from his brother's death, stood before the most powerful man in the Islamic world with an offer that would have seemed impossible just months before. Sultan Suleiman. Not yet. Bearing the epithet the Magnificent that history would bestow upon him, was a young ruler hungry for conquest and glory. At 25, he possessed the restless energy of youth combined with the calculating mind of a born strategist. The red-bearded corsair from North Africa requested an audience. The Sultan's advisors had counseled caution. Pirates, they argued, were useful tools, but poor allies, their loyalty lasted only as long as their profit margins. Hayreddin understood this skepticism intimately. His genius lay not in concealing his piratical past, but in transforming it into his greatest credential. Where other men might have apologized for their lawless origins, he presented them as evidence of his unique qualifications. "My Sultan," Hayreddin began, his voice carrying the measured cadence of a man who had learned to speak as carefully as he planned his battles. "The Mediterranean is not a pond to be controlled by conventional fleets sailing in neat formations. It is a wilderness of islands, currents, and hidden coves where only those who know its secrets can truly rule." The audacity of his proposal was breathtaking in its scope. Hayreddin offered not merely his allegiance, but his complete integration into the Ottoman system. He would surrender his independence to transform his corsair fleet into a legitimate naval force, and place his intimate knowledge of Mediterranean warfare at the empire's disposal. In return, he asked for something unprecedented: formal recognition. As an Ottoman admiral, complete with the resources and authority that rank entailed, the Sultan's advisors were divided. The Grand Vizier, Ibrahim Pasha, saw the strategic brilliance of the proposal. Here was a man who had spent decades learning the Mediterranean secrets, who commanded not just ships, but a network of intelligence that spanned from Gibraltar to the Levant. His very reputation was a weapon Christian. Merchants fled at the sight of his red banner, and enemy fleets altered their courses to avoid his hunting grounds. Yet others in the court remained skeptical. Could a man who had lived by his own law truly serve another's? The question hung in the perfumed air of the palace like incense. Heavy with implication, Hayreddin's masterstroke was his demonstration of how piracy and imperial service could be unified into something greater than either. Alone, he outlined a vision where his knowledge of irregular warfare would complement the empire's conventional naval power, where his network of corsairs would become an intelligence apparatus, and where his reputation for ruthless efficiency would serve Ottoman interests across the Mediterranean. The transformation that followed was as methodical as it was remarkable. Hayreddin's fleet underwent a complete reorganization, with Ottoman officers integrated into his command structure and his ships retrofitted to imperial standards. Yet this was no mere cosmetic change. It represented a fundamental shift in how naval power could be projected across the Mediterranean under the Ottoman banner. Hayreddin's forces became something unprecedented, a hybrid fleet that combined the mobility and local knowledge of corsairs with the resources and strategic coordination of a great empire. His ships could appear off the coast of Sicily, flying Ottoman colors, raid Spanish commerce with imperial sanction, and disappear into the maze of North African ports with the full backing of the Sultan's diplomatic network. The psychological impact was immediate and profound. Christian Europe had grown accustomed to treating corsairs as a criminal nuisance, a problem to be managed rather than a strategic threat. But Hayreddin's transformation elevated him from outlaw to legitimate commander of a great power's naval forces. Spanish admirals who had once dismissed him as a mere pirate now found themselves facing an opponent backed by the Ottoman Empire's vast resources and diplomatic reach. The Sultan's investment in Hayreddin's vision proved prescient. Within months of his appointment, Ottoman naval power in the Mediterranean expanded exponentially. The new admiral's intimate knowledge of every port, current, and seasonal wind pattern allowed him to deploy his forces with unprecedented precision. His network of former corsairs became an intelligence apparatus that kept Constantinople informed of Christian naval movements from Gibraltar to Venice. More crucially, Hayreddin understood that his greatest asset was not his ships or his men, but his reputation itself. The name Barbarossa had become a psychological weapon that could clear shipping lanes without firing a shot. Christian merchants increasingly chose to pay tribute rather than risk encountering his fleet, while rival admirals found their own crews demoralized by the mere possibility of facing the legendary Redbeard. The Empire's calculation was simple, but profound. By legitimizing Hayreddin's operations, they had transformed piracy from a chaotic force into a strategic instrument of state policy. The Mediterranean, which had been a contested waterway where multiple powers vied for control, was slowly becoming an Ottoman lake. In the map rooms of Topkapi Palace, where the Sultan's cartographers updated their charts with each new conquest, the transformation was visible in red ink. Port after port, island after island, the Ottoman sphere of influence expanded as Hayreddin's fleet established bases, negotiated treaties, and eliminated opposition with the systematic efficiency that only came from combining local expertise. With imperial resources, the gambit had succeeded beyond even Hayreddin's ambitious expectations. The pirate had become an admiral, but more importantly, the Ottoman Empire had acquired not just a naval commander, but an architect of Mediterranean dominance whose vision would reshape the balance of power for generations to come. The Mediterranean becomes Ottoman by 1534. The Mediterranean had become Hayreddin Barbarossa's personal chessboard, and he was proving himself a grand master of naval warfare. From his headquarters in Algiers, now rebuilt and fortified beyond Spanish reach, he orchestrated a systematic campaign of conquest that would transform the ancient Middle Sea into what European diplomats grimly termed the Ottoman Lake. The taking of Tunis in that pivotal year demonstrated the evolution of his strategic thinking. Unlike the impulsive raids of his youth, this was a methodical campaign that combined naval power, diplomatic intrigue, and psychological warfare into a devastating symphony of conquest. The city's Hafsid rulers, weakened by internal strife and Spanish pressure, found themselves facing not merely a corsair fleet, but the full weight of Ottoman imperial strategy channeled through their most capable admiral. Hayreddin's approach to Tunis revealed the revolutionary nature of his naval tactics. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the heavily fortified harbor, he employed a strategy of encirclement that showcased his intimate knowledge of Mediterranean geography. His fleet appeared simultaneously at multiple points along the coast, creating the illusion of a vast armada while actually utilizing carefully coordinated smaller forces. Spanish observers, watching from their own vessels, reported in bewildered dispatches that Barbarossa seemed to possess the ability to be in multiple places at once. The secret lay in his revolutionary ship designs and tactical innovations. Working with Ottoman naval architects, Hayreddin had developed a new class of vessel that combined the speed and maneuverability of traditional corsair galleys with the firepower and endurance of larger warships. These hybrid vessels, which he called hunting wolves, could operate independently for extended periods while maintaining the coordination necessary for complex fleet operations. More revolutionary still was his integration of intelligence networks into naval operations. Where other admirals relied on scouts and lookouts, Hayreddin had inherited and expanded his brother's network of spies, merchants, and sympathizers across the Mediterranean. Christian ports found themselves infiltrated by men who reported ship movements, cargo manifests, and defensive preparations directly to the Ottoman admiral. The psychological impact was devastating now. Christian fleet could move without the assumption that Barbarossa already knew their destination, strength, and intentions. The conquest of Corinth and Patros in the following years demonstrated how this intelligence advantage translated into tactical superiority.
At Corinth,
Hayreddin's forces appeared in the harbor before the Venetian defenders had even received word that Ottoman ships had left port. The garrison found themselves facing a perfectly coordinated assault that exploited every weakness in their defenses, as if their enemy possessed detailed architectural plans of their fortifications, which, indeed, he did. The fear that Hayreddin instilled across Christian Europe became a strategic weapon in itself. His red beard, now streaked with silver, but still magnificent, had become a symbol that transcended mere personal reputation. Venetian merchants reported that the sight of his distinctive banner could empty an entire port within hours, as captains cut their anchor cables and fled rather than risk encountering the Ottoman admiral's fleet. This psychological warfare was carefully cultivated and ruthlessly exploited. Hayreddin understood that reputation was force multiplier. Fearsome name could accomplish what required squadrons of ships. He deliberately encouraged the spread of stories about his supernatural abilities, his uncanny knowledge of his enemies' movements, and his inexorable pursuit of those who dared challenge Ottoman authority in the Mediterranean. Yet behind the legend was a master of human motivation who had solved one of naval warfare's most persistent problems: maintaining discipline and loyalty among diverse crews drawn from across the Mediterranean world. His fleets included Turkish sailors, North African corsairs, Greek navigators, and even European renegades who had converted to Islam, where other commanders struggled with competing loyalties and cultural tensions. Hayreddin created a unified fighting force through a combination of shared profit, religious mission, and personal charisma. The economic transformation he brought to Ottoman naval power was equally revolutionary. Traditional imperial fleets were expensive burdens that drained royal treasuries. Hayreddin's forces, by contrast, were largely self-supporting through captured prizes and tribute payments. His systematic approach to Mediterranean commerce raiding created a sustainable model of naval power that actually enriched the empire while expanding its influence. This economic dimension came crucial in the broader Ottoman-Habsburg rivalry that was reshaping European politics. Emperor Charles V's vast dominions required constant maritime communication and supply, making them vulnerable to the kind of systematic disruption that Hayreddin had perfected. Spanish gold from the Americas, Italian grain shipments, and military supplies for Habsburg armies all had to traverse waters. Increasingly dominated by Ottoman naval power, the strategic implications were profound. Where previous naval conflicts had been decided by single great battles, Hayreddin waged a different kind of warfare, one of economic strangulation and systematic erosion of enemy capabilities. His fleet didn't need to sink the entire Spanish navy. It merely needed to make Mediterranean commerce so hazardous that the economic foundations of Habsburg power began to crumble. By 1540, European diplomats were forced to acknowledge a new reality. The Mediterranean was no longer a neutral waterway where multiple powers competed on equal terms. It had become an Ottoman sphere of influence, patrolled by a fleet that combined the mobility of corsairs with the resources of the world's most powerful empire. From Gibraltar to the Levant, from Venice to North Africa, the red beard of Hayreddin Barbarossa had become the symbol of a new order. The potter's son from Lesbos had achieved something unprecedented in naval history: the transformation of an entire sea into the highway of a single empire. The Mediterranean, cradle of Western civilization, had become the Ottoman lake, and Hayreddin Barbarossa was its undisputed master. When pirates besieged an emperor, the summer of 1543 witnessed a scene that would have been inconceivable just decades earlier. Ottoman war galleys flying their Crescent banners sailed unopposed into the Christian harbor of Toulon, while French Courtiers bowed respectfully to a red-bearded admiral whose fleet had once been the terror of European commerce. The impossible had become reality. Hayreddin Barbarossa, the former potter's son from Lesbos, had become the kingmaker of European politics. The audacious siege of Nice that followed represented the pinnacle of Hayreddin's strategic genius and the ultimate expression of how completely the Mediterranean's balance of power had shifted. Here was a man who had begun his career raiding merchant vessels, now coordinating military operations with the most Christian king of France against the Holy Roman Emperor. The irony was not lost on contemporary observers. The pirate had become indispensable to empires. The alliance between Sultan Suleiman and King Francis I of France was born of mutual necessity. Both monarchs faced the overwhelming power of Charles V's Habsburg domains. Yet the practical implementation of their partnership required a naval commander, capable of projecting Ottoman power into the Western Mediterranean. Only Hayreddin possessed both the tactical brilliance and the fleet necessary to make this unprecedented alliance more than a diplomatic fantasy. His arrival in French waters sent shockwaves through European chancelleries. Venetian ambassadors reported in stunned dispatches that Ottoman ships were being resupplied in Christian ports, their crews mingling freely with French sailors while planning operations against the emperor's territories. The psychological impact was devastating. If Ottoman power could reach the coast of France, no Christian realm could consider itself safe. The Siege of Nice itself was a masterpiece of combined operations that showcased everything Hayreddin had learned in his decades of Mediterranean warfare. The city, a Habsburg stronghold guarding the approaches to Italy, had been considered impregnable from the sea. Its fortifications, designed by the finest military engineers of the age, had been built to withstand conventional naval bombardment. An amphibious assault, Hayreddin's approach was anything but conventional. Rather than attempting a direct assault on the city's sea-facing defenses, he coordinated with French land forces to create a systematic siege that exploited every weakness in Nice's position. His fleet established a complete blockade that prevented any relief by sea, while his naval artillery, positioned at carefully calculated angles, could reach targets within the city that land-based cannon could not touch. The technical innovation displayed during the siege demonstrated how far Ottoman naval capabilities had advanced under Hayreddin's leadership. His ships carried specialized siege equipment that could be rapidly deployed from the water, while his crews had been trained in amphibious operations that combined traditional corsair tactics with formal military engineering. The result was a new form of warfare that European defenders had never encountered, and for which they had no adequate response. More devastating than the physical siege was its psychological impact on European nobility. For the first time in centuries, a major Christian city was being besieged by Muslim forces operating from a Christian port with the full cooperation of a Christian king. The medieval certainties that had structured European politics for centuries were collapsing before the pragmatic realities of Renaissance power politics. Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe, found himself strategically paralyzed by the actions of a man he had once dismissed as a mere pirate. His vast domains, connected by Mediterranean sea routes, were suddenly vulnerable to coordinated attacks by an enemy who could appear anywhere along thousands of miles of coastline. The emperor's advisors were forced to acknowledge that Hayreddin had achieved something unprecedented: strategic parity with the greatest empire in the world. The siege's success transformed Hayreddin from a talented admiral into a figure of European significance. Diplomats who had once refused to acknowledge his existence now competed for his attention. French nobles who had initially been scandalized by their alliance with a former corsair began to court his favor, recognizing that he had become indispensable to their king's foreign policy. The moment marked the permanent shift in Mediterranean power dynamics. No longer could Christian powers assume that Muslim naval forces were confined to the eastern Mediterranean or the North African coast. Hayreddin had demonstrated that Ottoman power could be projected anywhere in the Middle Sea, could ally with Christian powers against other Christians, and could hold European capitals hostage to his strategic decisions. The ultimate irony was complete. The man who had begun his career as an outlaw preying on merchant shipping had become the arbiter of European balance of power. Kings competed for his alliance. Emperors altered their policies to account for his capabilities. And the Mediterranean itself had become his instrument for reshaping the politics of an entire continent. When the siege finally ended with Nice's capitulation, it was not merely a military victory, but a transformation of European consciousness. The age when Christian unity could be assumed in the face of Muslim expansion had ended. In its place stood a new reality, where the most feared Muslim admiral in the Mediterranean could find Christian ports open to his fleet and Christian kings, eager for his partnership. The pottery maker's son from Lesbos had achieved the impossible. He had made himself indispensable to the very powers he had once terrorized. In the smoke rising from Nice's battered walls, European observers could see the future, a Mediterranean where Ottoman power was not merely tolerated but actively courted by Christian kings desperate to maintain their own positions in an increasingly complex world. The pirate had become a kingmaker, and Europe would never be the same. The man behind the myth in the quiet hours before dawn, when the Mediterranean lay calm and silver beneath the stars, Hayreddin Barbarossa would often stand alone on the deck of his flagship, watching the horizon and wrestling with ghosts only he could see. The red beard that had become the symbol of Ottoman naval supremacy was now streaked with white, and the man who bore it felt the weight of every victory, every decision. Every life that had brought him to this pinnacle of power, fame he had discovered, was a prison as confining as any dungeon. The name Hayreddin Barbarossa had become larger than the man who carried it, a legend that demanded constant performance. Kings and sultans saw only the fearsome admiral whose reputation could shift the balance of European politics. They never glimpsed Khizr, the potter's son who still remembered the texture of clay beneath his fingers in the simple joy of shaping something beautiful from raw earth. The cost of transformation had been measured not in gold or blood, but in the gradual erosion of the man he had once been. His family bore the heaviest burden of his choices, his wives, for he had married several times. As was the custom of powerful men, lived in the shadow of his legend, knowing that their husband belonged as much to history as to them. His children grew up with a father who was simultaneously the most famous admiral in the Mediterranean and a stranger, whose duties perpetually called him away from their embrace with his sons. Hayreddin felt the particular anguish of a man trying to pass on both legacy and humanity. He wanted them to inherit his strategic brilliance, his understanding of power, his ability to navigate the treacherous waters of international politics. Yet he also feared that in teaching them to be worthy successors to the Barbarossa name, he might rob them of the simple humanity that he himself had sacrificed on the altar of ambition. Hassan, his eldest son, showed promise as a naval commander, but lacked the ruthless calculation that had made his father legendary. During their private conversations, Hayreddin would catch himself studying the young man's face, searching for signs of the killer instinct that survival in their world demanded. The irony was bitter. He had become so successful at being Hayreddin Barbarossa that he had forgotten how to be simply a father. The loneliness of leadership pressed upon him with increasing weight as the years passed. In council chambers and on the decks of his ships, he was surrounded by men who hung on his every word, who would follow him into the gates of hell itself. Yet none of them truly knew him. They saw the admiral, the strategist, the legend, but not the man who sometimes woke in the middle of the night. Haunted by the faces of those he had killed in his rise to power, his relationship with Sultan Suleiman had evolved into something complex and bittersweet. The young ruler who had once eagerly sought his counsel now possessed the full confidence of maturity and imperial power. Their conversations, while still marked by mutual respect, carried an undertone of inevitable transition. Hayreddin could see his own future in the Sultan's growing independence, the day when even the greatest admiral would become expendable. The burden of maintaining loyalty in a world of shifting alliances grew heavier with each passing year. Men who had once been enemies now sought his friendship, while old allies eyed him with suspicion born of his very success. The French, who had welcomed his fleet to their shores, now worried about the precedent they had set. The Ottomans, who had elevated him to unprecedented heights, occasionally wondered if their admiral had become too powerful for the empire's good. In rare moments of unguarded reflection, Hayreddin would allow himself to imagine what his life might have been if he had remained Khizr, if he had never felt the pull of the sea or the weight of his brother's legacy. Would he have been content shaping pottery in some quiet workshop, his hands creating beauty instead of orchestrating destruction? The thought both comforted and tormented him, a glimpse of a path not taken that seemed simultaneously more peaceful and utterly foreign to the man he had become, the awareness of his own mortality had begun to press upon him like a physical weight. Each battle carried the possibility of being his last. Each strategic decision might be the final move in a game that had consumed his entire adult life. The red beard that had once been a symbol of vitality now reminded him daily of time's passage, and he found himself increasingly concerned with questions of legacy and succession. Yet perhaps the greatest burden was the simplest: the price of having transformed so completely from Khizr to Hayreddin that he could no longer remember which man was the performance and which was real. In becoming the legend the world needed, he had lost the person he had once been, and no amount of power or glory could restore that fundamental piece of his humanity. The man behind the myth stood alone with his thoughts, watching the eternal Mediterranean, and wondering if the price of becoming Barbarossa had been worth the cost of ceasing to be simply himself. Death of a sea god, the summer of 1546, found Hayreddin Barbarossa in the imperial capital of Constantinople. Far from the rolling decks and salt spray that had defined his extraordinary life, at 73, the legendary admiral who had terrorized Christian Europe and reshaped the Mediterranean's balance of power was finally showing his age. The red beard that had struck fear into the hearts of kings had turned white as sea foam, and the hands that had once wielded a scimitar with deadly precision now trembled slightly as they held the maps. He still studied with undiminished intensity, yet, even in decline, his mind remained sharp as a Damascus blade. From his residence overlooking the Golden Horn, he continued to coordinate Ottoman naval operations, his strategic vision as clear as ever. Sultan Suleiman, now truly deserving of his epithet, the Magnificent, visited regularly, seeking counsel from the man who had helped build his empire's maritime supremacy. These meetings had evolved into something resembling friendship too. Aging rulers who had shared the burden of power and the weight of history, the gradual handover of operational command to his successors had been a delicate process. Hayreddin understood that his legend was both an asset and a burden for those who would follow. His reputation was so formidable that any successor would be measured against impossibly high standards. He worked carefully to ensure that the transition would preserve the institutional knowledge he had built while allowing new leaders to establish their own authority. His sons, particularly Hassan, had proven capable commanders, though they lacked their father's unique combination of strategic brilliance and personal magnetism. Hayreddin recognized this limitation without bitterness. Few men in any generation possessed the rare qualities that had allowed him to transform from potter's son to the master of the Mediterranean. His legacy would live on in the naval traditions he had established, the intelligence networks he had built, and the strategic principles he had codified. When death finally came for Hayreddin Barbarossa in July 1546, it arrived not with the drama of battle or the violence that had marked so much of his life, but quietly in his sleep. The man who had defied emperors and reshaped the fate of nations simply slipped away, as if the sea itself had finally called him home. The news of his passing sent shockwaves throughout the Ottoman Empire and beyond. Sultan Suleiman, who had lost not just an admiral but a mentor and friend, declared a period of official mourning. The funeral that followed was a spectacle worthy of the legend. Tens of thousands gathered in Constantinople to witness the final journey of the man who had made the Mediterranean an Ottoman lake. His burial in the mausoleum that Sultan Suleiman had built in his honor was attended by the highest officials of the empire. The ceremony was both Islamic and unique, reflecting the extraordinary nature of the man being honored. Prayers were offered not just for the soul of Hayreddin Barbarossa, but for the era he had embodied, the age when individual genius could reshaped the destiny of empires. The immediate impact of his death on Mediterranean naval power was profound. Christian Europe, which had lived in fear of his name for over 3 decades, experienced a collective sigh of relief, mixed with grudging respect. Venetian senators who had cursed his name openly acknowledged his strategic brilliance. Spanish admirals who had spent their careers trying to counter his moves recognized that they had been facing a master of naval warfare, whose like might never be seen again. Yet the mourning was not confined to the Ottoman Empire. Across the Mediterranean, from the corsair bases of North Africa to the merchant ports of Italy, men who had served under his banner or lived in his shadow understood that an era had ended. The age of the corsair admirals, when individual captains could rise from obscurity to command the navies of empires, had reached its symbolic conclusion with the death of its greatest exemplar. The Mediterranean itself seemed different after Hayreddin's passing. The sea that had been his stage for decades of conquest and statecraft would continue to see naval battles and strategic maneuvering, but never again would it be dominated by a single figure whose personality and vision could reshape the balance of power across an entire region. The potter's son from Lesbos was gone, but the legend of Barbarossa would sail on through history, inspiring future generations of naval commanders and reminding the world that in the right hands, command of the sea could be command of destiny itself. The name that never dies in the centuries following Hayreddin Barbarossa's death, his name achieved something that eludes most historical figures' true immortality. While kings and emperors faded into footnotes, the red-bearded admiral from Lesbos became a legend that transcended the boundaries of time, culture, and national identity. His story lived on not merely in history books, but in the collective imagination of the Mediterranean world. The Ottoman Empire preserved his legacy with reverence bordering on veneration. For generations after his death, Ottoman naval tactics bore the unmistakable imprint of his innovations. His emphasis on intelligence gathering, his integration of diverse fighting forces, and his understanding of naval power as an instrument of economic warfare became fundamental principles of Ottoman maritime strategy. Naval commanders throughout the empire's history studied his campaigns, trying to unlock the secrets of his success. The tactical manual he left behind, dictated to scribes in his final years, became required reading at Ottoman naval academies. His concepts of coordinated fleet operations, the use of smaller vessels to achieve strategic surprise, and the importance of maintaining multiple bases across a theater of operations influenced naval thinking well into the modern era. Military historians would later recognize elements of his strategic vision in the convoy systems of World War II and the distributed naval operations of contemporary maritime powers. Yet perhaps more remarkable than his professional legacy was his transformation in popular memory. The man who had once been reviled across Christian Europe as a pirate and terrorist gradually evolved into something approaching a folk hero. European writers of the Romantic period, fascinated by the exotic and the adventurous, began to reimagine Barbarossa as a figure of tragic nobility, man driven by loyalty to his faith and his people rather than mere greed. This transformation reflected a broader shift in how history remembers its controversial figures. As the immediate fear of Ottoman expansion faded, European historians could afford to admire Barbarossa's strategic genius, his loyalty to his subordinates, and his remarkable rise from humble origins. The pottery maker's son who had terrorized Christian shipping became, in retrospect, a symbol of meritocracy and self-determination. The question of his true nature, terrorist or patriot, became one of the enduring debates of Mediterranean history. To Ottoman historians, he was unquestionably a hero who had served his empire with distinction and expanded Islamic influence through his brilliance and courage. To European scholars, he represented the complex intersection of individual ambition and imperial service. A man whose methods were brutal, but whose achievements were undeniably impressive. Modern naval historians recognize him as something even more significant: the bridge between 2 ages of maritime warfare. He embodied the transition from the chaotic world of medieval piracy to the organized naval power of modern empires. His career demonstrated how individual genius could be channeled into institutional strength, how irregular warfare could be systematized without losing its effectiveness. The ongoing fascination with his life story speaks to something deeper than mere historical curiosity. In an age of corporate bureaucracy and institutional power, Barbarossa represents the possibility of individual transformation. The idea that humble origins need not limit ultimate achievement. His story resonates because it combines the adventure of piracy with the dignity of imperial service, the excitement of individual heroism with the satisfaction of institutional legacy. Perhaps most remarkably, his name continues to inspire naval forces around the world. Operation Barbarossa, Nazi Germany's invasion of the Soviet Union, borrowed his name for its scope and ambition. Modern naval exercises invoke his memory, and his tactical innovations are studied in military academies from Annapolis to Istanbul. The ultimate measure of Barbarossa's immortality lies not in the monuments erected in his honor or the history books that record his achievements, but in the simple fact that his name still carries weight. Centuries after his death, Barbarossa remains synonymous with naval mastery, strategic brilliance, and the transformation of individuals into legends. The pottery maker's son from Lesbos achieved the rarest form of human success. He became immortal not through conquest alone, but through the sheer force of his story. In doing so, he proved that in the right hands, at the right moment, one person truly can change the course of history.